Conversation on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Thanks. A great thanks to our guests for joining and our hosts. A quick thank you to our tech support on all things tech related, Thin Lee, keeping us going as always. Thanks also to Pamela Crossan in the history department as well for keeping us going as well. A brief land acknowledgement for CSUSB. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, Yuhaviatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and the occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values at CSUSB and in this series of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. And by offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indians and Indigenous peoples. Thank you to our guests for joining, and thanks to one of our leading hosts, Matt Patino, who is a graduate of Cal State San Bernardino, our MA in History program, and also a veteran of the Rialto Police Department. Matt, please take it from here.
Thank you, Jeremy. Today we are joined by Dr. Madeline Stenersen, an assistant professor of psychology at St. Louis University, and Dr. Cassandra Young, and an assistant professor at the University of Denver in the Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies program. Both Drs. Young and Stenersen are experts in the topics related to gender, race, law enforcement, the criminalization of victims of sex trafficking, and police harassment and violence towards sex workers. Dr. Stenersen received her PhD from the University of Memphis, and her research focuses on individual system and level approaches to promoting health equity and well-being among marginalized populations, with a specific emphasis on the intersection of criminal justice, LGBTQ plus communities, and individuals involved in the sex industry. In these areas, she uses both community-based and big data methods to identify disparities in societal and treatment services, develop, implement, and evaluate culturally informed interventions to address these disparities, and to examine the impact of system decision-making and policy on marginalized groups. Her recent work involves a participatory approach to understanding the impact of health policies on sex workers in the U.S., and using large data to understand the impact of transgender-related legislation on mental health outcomes. Her community-based work involves partnerships with multiple organizations in the U.S. and abroad to understand and combat discrimination and violence. Dr. Young, researches human trafficking in the U.S. with a focus on Black communities, and particularly how victims navigate the criminal justice system as victims and as offenders. Dr. Stenersen and Dr. Young, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can just kick us off like we sort of talked about. I appreciate the introduction. I know, again, it's kind of broad, so I can speak a little bit more to the work that I've done more recently and sort of how I got here. I am a counseling psychologist by training. I was a clinician for a while, working in both community and correctional settings with individuals who are victims and survivors of sexual violence, as well as individuals who have been charged with crimes related to sexual violence. So I worked a lot of the time in drop-in centers and in community-based centers. I always joked that I never had an office. It was always outside, serving people just kind of in the community. And one of my first placements was working at a drop-in center for street-based sex workers in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I have some familial history with substance use and sort of involvement in the sex industry. And so it really sort of caught my attention and has sort of brought me down this path. So I always credit the Benedict Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for like starting my whole journey here. And they have a wonderful program and organization that really just gives people the resources that they want and places no judgment on them as to what they need. And coming from that kind of thinking, really, it surprised me a lot what I started to see in different areas of, say, this sort of spectrum of services for people in the sex industry, including victims and survivors of sex trafficking, where the kind of agency that happens in some of those in some of those service settings is varied depending on kind of the funder's background, the sort of motivation of the organization. We also see this a lot internationally, where faith-based organizations are often the kind of vastly outnumber non-faith-based organizations in working with sex trafficking survivors. So really what has kind of, this is just my beginning ramble, right? What has come out of my research program and first working with primarily sex trafficking organizations that worked in very closely with the police, provided kind of diversion type programmings that we now know are not ideal in the way that they were served then, and really kind of navigating that landscape into primarily what I do now, which is work directly with sex worker communities to help them fight and identify their own needs for human rights and anti-violence, right? I am a firm believer that if you want to eliminate trafficking or violence in the sex industry, you need sex workers. And to do that, you need to respect their humanity, rights, and work as actual work. So I've been working with the sex work community for a long time, and I still work with some anti-trafficking organizations, primarily focused on kind of what they're doing that could then be sort of disingenuous or disrespectful to sex workers, and how they may be driving away people that they actually want to serve. So that's been honestly the best part about the job that I get to do. I work currently, the Hustle and Health Project is related to looking at the impact of health policy on sex workers. And we're in partnership with the Sex Workers Outreach Project of LA and Chicago, the Black Sex Workers Collective, and also Strippers United. And so a lot of different organizations kind of coming together to really want to understand these kinds of impacts, especially as there's so much legislation and so much kind of different things happening without input from the communities that it's meant to serve. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation with Dr. Young. I think we have a lot to talk about, and I think we have a lot of, there's always a million like perspectives in this. And I think having these ongoing conversations is really how we're going to navigate this complexity. So that's what I'm doing now.
I agree, and thank you. So I'll do similar and share kind of how I got into this work. So I am not community based right now. I've taken a break just to focus solely on research. But I got into this, it's more of a personal connection. So my whole my focus, as I said in the bio, is that I primarily focus on sex trafficking within the Black community, particularly how victims and survivors of trafficking navigate the criminal justice system as both victims and offenders. I got into this because when I was young, I lived in Southern California in a town called Oxnard. If any of y'all know that town, yeah, it's a good town. Love that town, my home. And where I lived, it was not the best area, I'll admit, but it's still home to me. And there were alleyways that we would have to go down, and I would see things that I didn't quite understand. And as much as my mother and my uncle who lived with us try to protect me, there's so much that you can protect from, particularly when you're a nosy little kid like I am, or was. I'm not a kid, but I'm still nosy. One day I started to just basically understand that what was happening to them was violence because they were not there by choice. These were largely children. As I look back, I realized that they were actually kids. These were not youth engaged in survival sex work. They were being controlled by a third party, by a trafficker. And one prominent one was the woman that I know. I call her a woman because she's a woman now. We kept in contact, was being trafficked by her father and then later on her brother. Um, she's doing well and doing great work in her community now. So I became really interested in understanding why this was happening. And then the neighborhood got too violent, and my mother moved us out to Colorado, where I now permanently reside. Um, Here, when we were, so this was in like the early 90s, the word trafficking really didn't emerge. We didn't have our first comprehensive anti-trafficking legislation until 2000 with the Bill Clinton administration. And the words that we're using more like, just prostitute, different other derogatory kind of terms that I will not say here. But there was no focus on like, we need to get them off the streets and help them rehabilitate them, give them the resources. It was pretty much slap cuffs on them and get them out the way because they're unpleasant to see and we don't want to be bothered. Particularly, this is also still on the tail end of the height of the war on drugs. It was also tied up with trying to do drug enforcement and anti-vice enforcement. Anti-vice and anti-drug enforcement are not ideal for trying to help people in need. They're to arrest criminals. There's not a victim-centered or trauma-informed approach for this, which is something that I'm sure we'll probably get to in a little while. But when I was in Colorado, very different environment. And one day I found a magazine. It was National Geographic because I was at the dentist. Nobody likes a dentist, so I was trying to distract myself. And it said modern day slavery. Now, I'm a Black woman. I've always known race and experienced racism and misogynoir very early in my life, unfortunately. So I understood how people that look like me came here and why racial relations are what they are today. So I saw it, picked it up, and was curious. And then I realized they were describing children who were experiencing the exact same thing that I had observed, except they were talked about so much differently. They were called like, America's children, precious, and need to be protected, and I'm not disagreeing with that. But it was very clear at the language that was used that there was something different, and I came across one word in your, or rephrase rather, in your backyard in our suburban neighborhoods, and that was the difference. They were talking about children that were socially valued, that were being targeted, and then it was a problem. I originally, when I got to college and started learning about research, I thought maybe I'm being too biased. Maybe we're using this language because we're better informed, we have better legislation, we have better training. My first research project that's going to hopefully be my first monograph, fingers crossed, was interviewing Black women who have been trafficked at some point in their life in the US. I have a total of 35 interviews, 30 of which are going to be used in the book. These are, and this is a case study, so I'm not going to say like this is every single survivor's experience, of course. No matter when they are trafficked, before the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, before training, no matter what it was, they were normally trafficked as children. Every single one of them, except for two of them who managed to come across good officers with good training or just good people, I don't know. They were all arrested on prostitution charges when they were juveniles. That is illegal. You're not supposed to arrest them for something they legally cannot consent to. So that got me thinking that maybe it really wasn't just legislation. Maybe there's something socially going on, primarily of how we actually categorize and treat each other based on race, gender, occupation, mental health, wellness, your socioeconomic status, pretty much everything, how those all create these vacuums of vulnerability and how traffickers prey on them. So what I do now, I've shifted. Previously, I wanted to use my research to try to like better and make improvements and policy suggestions for legislation for policing. Because like has been said, as my colleague here just so aptly said, the people that are directly impacted by it usually aren't in the room when these decisions are being made about them. It's always decisions being made in their favor or on behalf of them, but they are rarely allowed in those rooms. And when they are, it's pretty sparse, quite honestly. But now my attention has really been focused on how do we as a society begin to approach these vulnerabilities and start to protect one another for prevention so we don't even need to get to that particular moment there. I will say one thing that when we talk about policing, our approach to policing in the US has gotten better. I'm not going to deny the progress we've made. We've made a lot of really good progress. But unfortunately, so much of our policing is off the bat adversarial, and you cannot approach someone who is traumatized, who is afraid, and who is in need of help as an opponent. You treat them that way, they are going to clam up and then treat you likewise the exact same kind of way. We're still very much in our mindset that we need to lock up. We can lock away or incarcerate our way out of these social problems and these crises, but we cannot. If we could have done that, then we wouldn't be here having this conversation, because we've been doing this pretty much extensively since the 60s, and we haven't made enough progress, in my personal opinion. And one of those ways I believe that we need to is, and we need to approach this too, is exactly as my colleague here just said, we do need to really kind of focus on and understanding and respecting sex worker rights, no matter what our personal feelings may be on that, and instead see them as individuals looking to make their working environment safer and to try to keep predators out of it. Because it is true, wherever sex work markets are, traffickers are going to be there, but they go there because they know that they are sites of illegal activity that they can manipulate and use to wield over their victims. So keeping a group of people as prosecuted and as marginalized as we have, it's going to be counterproductive. And quite honestly, and especially when we know that people who are usually poor, people of color, non-cisgender folks, and folks in the LGBTQ community, and folks too with mental health illness, we typically see them disproportionately involved in this, because those are the only ways that they can usually make some sort of material or monetary money for them to make ends meet, or if they need just something else happening as well. And particularly for youth who are fleeing violent situations, not uncommon for them to turn to survival sex work because they need to have something to sustain themselves. That's an indication that we don't have safety nets for the most vulnerable in our society, and we are creating victims, or I should say, we're creating venues for victims to create it, and for their abusers and traffickers to have a lot of, unfortunately, legitimation with their weaponization of that vulnerability as well. I hope that made sense. And I'll just keep rambling, so I'm gonna stop.
Yeah. If I could jump on to that, all of those words
Certainly.
were super amazing. I completely agree. I think it was a great path to go down. I feel like I could say so many things in agreement with all of that. One of the things that really struck me was just that, yes, the idea that there's so many of these interventions, there's this idea and sort of terminology around modern day slavery that has become really popular, that is not only like insensitive, would be the minimizing of that, but also the idea that everybody has the same goal for safety. And and I think a lot of the times we get into, a lot of people have opinions and perspectives on this. There's always this kind of moral feeling that is induced for a lot of people around like what sex work is and what it isn't, and is it should be this and it should be that. But like I do think regardless of any of that, we all have this idea that we don't want people to be hurt and we don't want people to be abused. And we have evidence that shows what can help that. And what can help that is the things that you were speaking to, right? That sort of systemic resources, right? The support for people, the idea that they can go out and not be shamed, potentially go to some kind of entity for support or safety and not be incarcerated, not be arrested, and not be, again, victimized or traumatized. So I'm just agreeing with all of this. I think there's sometimes an idea that like the anti-trafficking and the sex work advocacy organizations and like ideas are separate, when really there's a commonality here. And what I think sometimes, I'm reaching here, but what sometimes seems to get in the way is that morality piece for people of like, well, they're doing this, but they must not want to do this. So I know what they want and I know what they need. And I think if we could step back and say, like, what does this person actually say that they need? And provide that to them, and then believe them about what their life is. And so, yeah, all of that, sorry, follow up ramble.
No, it wasn't
Uh,
a ramble. And I'm sorry, just real quick, please. And on that too, with like talking about like having these ideas about people who work with morality, it seems we're stuck in these two ideas of how people are envisioning sex work as like down and out, destitute, kind of like shrinking victim, and then the other one is like living a luxury life as like a sugar baby or something, when that's really not the grim reality, or not shouldn't grim, not the reality of how diverse the sex work field is, and particularly the reason why people get into what they do and the purposes that they actually serve. And that idea of morality, like this thing is repulsive to me or it's offensive to me, it should be offensive to everybody else. And that's not true. And that is not the way that you approach solutions, because people are too nuanced in why they do things. Sex workers, you can get 100 of them in a room, they'll have commonalities, but they're not going to unanimously agree on anything. They're a group of people, just the same as everybody else. The same with victims as well. Some will say like, yeah, I want more faith-based services. Some will say, no, we have too many. Let's actually go with this. You can't treat an entire group of people as the same and pluck out and cherry pick the pieces that are just more digestible for a broader society. Sorry, I interrupted.
That's
Yeah.
okay. Dr. Young, you mentioned the diversity of sex workers. So for our audience, because I think maybe we all come in and we think, kind of monolithically, this is what a sex worker is, but you mentioned the diversity. Can you kind of give us, what are those parameters? Because I think it gets muddied, morality versus legality. So can you kind of, who is the sex worker? How are you defining them?
I'm defining them as individuals that are able to consent to the acts. So that involves
Okay.
age, mental capability, as well as material constraints. And that's a little bit more of an ambiguous term. That one I kind of leave for people that do enter it, but don't actually approve of what they're doing themselves. It's just something that they do out of desperation. I don't particularly, I'm kind of on that like spectrum of how I see it, of like the, what we call like the empowerment and the oppression paradigm. Like it can go along that spectrum, and that third group of like, depending on what their material needs are, they can oscillate between those two as they completely need to. But for me, the legal parameters are if you consent to it and if you're able to consent to it. If you're, in an abusive marriage and this is what you're doing because your partner says, well, we just need this, go do this really quick, and if you disobey them, they're going to smack you. That's not consenting.
Right.
That's a very common scenario, actually, particularly within the Black community. If someone is addicted to drugs and they are being kept addicted to drugs and make them more compliant, that's a
Mhm.
victim. That's not someone willing to do this. That's how I envision. I'm looking at the abilities to consent, people's age, and just where they stand for how they understand their own experience. I would even say I try to avoid using the word victim. I use it for more simplistic and like easier um,
Mhm.
terminology, especially like in more like time parameters like we have now, because so many victims will even like that word themselves. I always ask people when I do primarily interviews with survivors and people that have been impacted by the things that we're talking about here. I ask them how they want me to refer to them. Out of those 35 I mentioned, only one of them wanted to use the word victim. The other ones wanted different words because for them, they acknowledged that they did not want to do what they were doing. They were being forced to. But victim to them meant something else. So how we also need to take into consideration how people are defining their own experience with that. So I usually model whatever, whoever it is I'm speaking with, especially if they're impacted by it, what they are viewing it, to be respectful and understand that I'm not the expert in their life experiences, they are. So I need to be respectful of that and mindful and use the same language that they're using.
Oh, that's interesting. There seems to be a level of paternalism across the entire thing, even for those who can give consent. As mentioned in the intros, you both do some work with those who are being trafficked, those who cannot give consent. What's that fine line? Where do we step in and say, okay, we should intervene here, we should not?
I have a couple ways I can answer that.
Okay, yeah.
The most simplistic one I'll say, like if like I'm a cop or I work in the criminal justice system, I have a set of rules that I follow for that. It's force, fraud, or coercion, and then age. The presence of any of those that can mark those, that's when you intervene. That's when you make the approach for differentiating someone who's being trafficked and someone that's engaging in sex work, either temporarily, maybe permanently, depending on their situation. So that's the most simplistic way I can say that. The more complex way I could say that is, yeah, let's look at force, fraud, coercion, and age. But we also need to look at what kind of is preceding those. Is this a case of child abuse? You need to simultaneously attack the child abuse and the trafficking. If you just intervene on the trafficking for one, this is a very common scenario too, particularly in the Black community, you're going to temporarily remove that child, probably put them into an overloaded system. Maybe another family member is going to take them in. You're still leaving them multiply vulnerable in multiple different ways by doing that. So for me, when we actually step in, you need to be prepared to step in and attack every angle that created the forced fraud coercion, and especially for people that are young or people that are other like special victimizations, like people with disabilities or learning disabilities or things like that. So for me, it's not a matter of like intervening on the trafficking or the sex work. It's intervening on pretty much every single piece that led them up to that moment, which is difficult. I don't think our CJ, I don't think any of our systems in the United States actually are prepared to do that, quite honestly. I don't think they are. I think it's possible to get us there if we can make some real life changes. But that to me is like where that fine line is. That's where it is. So that's the best I can kind of condense it. I talk too much. I'm sorry. I'm too wordy.
Okay.
You're totally good. Do you want me to follow up, or do you have another
Yes,
question?
please. Yeah,
Oh,
please.
because I'm just in agreement. I also say that this kind of trafficking, like sort of line thing, also goes back to like what we sort of media wise and sort of societally wise think of like what trafficking looks like. And it like, I mean, I tell people all the time, it's like really not the movie Taken, like all the time. Nor is it The Sound of Freedom, because now I have to say that now. But really, like in the United States, it is really a lot more complex. Like Dr. Young was saying, it intersects with all of these other situations. Again, I do not want to categorize everybody's situation, but in kind of a lot of cases, there's this kind of potentially a familial element, the environmental element in which the child or adult is like around, like what kinds of supports they have, what kinds of resources they have. And so the identification as far as like for law enforcement can be really difficult. And we recognize that that's the case, but also recognizing that by giving these resources, you're essentially providing people with what a lot of other people already have at their disposal, but then just giving the chance to kind of potentially choose or like have a choice, right? Or have the support to be able to kind of get out of a potentially coercive situation if that's the safe option, right? So we do borrow sometimes from intimate partner and domestic violence, where it's like it's not always safe to just say leave. You know, it's not always the safest thing, but working with that person to figure out what their needs are. And I agree with Dr. Young that it's unfortunately not the system that we have that has the personnel or resources to sit down with somebody and be like, what kinds of like help do you need? You know, regardless of kind of the identifying factor, what could you do? Like what could you use? And if we had that, you'd see a lot of people kind of navigating their own path with support. And it would potentially lead to like maybe not needing as much of this, like this is a trafficking victim, this isn't, but just getting people who are in situations in which they're not choosing to do something and they're being forced or coerced to do it in a different scenario where they have more choice and agency. So, yeah.
So you mentioned a couple movies, which immediately brought up a couple of instances for me. I immediately went to Pretty Woman, and then I went to this year's Best Picture winner, Nora. So how are you fighting? How are you stripping away this vision that we have? You know, I mean, you could be really glamorous. Look, I could marry a millionaire, or the opposite. You know, how do you strip that away to get to what the reality is for sex workers?
Yeah, it's so hard. I can speak to the easiest one first, which is The Sound of Freedom. So The Sound of Freedom. Hey, so I'm just gonna latch onto that one because it's the easiest. Is like The Sound of Freedom. I mean, it's supposed to be about anti-trafficking, and so many anti-trafficking organizations that I still work with really struggled with this movie because they're like, we want people to know about trafficking. Yes, please ask these questions and learn about this stuff. And at the same time, this is not like a good thing to be promoting, this kind of savioristic, especially in the international context. There was so much fight about like the messaging of this and really how it doesn't exemplify what human trafficking cases typically are, even in international contexts. They're so much more complex. And we see a lot of destruction and harm done when the kind of raids and kind of persecution that was outlined in the video do happen in real life, right?
Yeah.
We know that those do not lead to the resources that people need. And so that was a real struggle. I think I will admit, I am like, it's on my watch list. I haven't watched Honora yet. Have you seen it, Dr.
Yeah, it's
Young?
very good, actually.
I know, I've heard it's so
Yeah.
good. But I feel like that's the real struggle with media and just societal ideals in general, is that like we all would love to have this, like, this is what this is and this is what this is. And it's always so much more complex than that. So it's possible that the other movies like are exemplifying somebody's experience, but just being open to the fact that like it's not a catch-all, right? After The Sound of Freedom, we had survivors come up and say that people were telling them that they didn't actually count as a survivor of trafficking because their scenario was different than in the movie. And this is obviously not what we want. So just adding that little bit of color, the little bit of complexity in there, just allowing your brain to be like, this may be one example, but whatever I'm hearing from the people who's actually been through it is also an example. So going back to like believing people. So
I want to piggyback. I have not seen Sound of Freedom. I saw the trailer and got the ick, so I didn't watch it. But I haven't even heard of Nora, actually. I heard there was like controversy with the lead actress, but I haven't been paying attention to it. I got off of social media, thankfully, and it's been such a huge weight off my shoulders. But I was amazed that people actually thought trafficking happened like in the movie Taken, because to me it was just like a fun movie. I like Liam Neeson. I was like, it's cool, like cliched action movie. All right, good for, if I'm bored. But I was amazed to actually learn, especially when I started teaching, that that's what they primarily thought it looked like. And I mean, yeah, it's true. Like people are kidnapped in the trafficking situations, both domestically and internationally. And I think what I try to do is show my students when I'm teaching human trafficking, like the nuances and what it looks like give them a really what I think is actually unfortunately very commonplace of when a child is being trafficked by their parent. They get dropped off at school, do the regular school activities, then get picked up. They're forced to do a couple of like sex acts for money, and then they go home, do their homework. Maybe they're allowed to go spend time with their friends. They don't necessarily view themselves as a trafficking victim. It's something that they unfortunately had to deal with when they're in childhood from a bad parent. And when we have those kinds of like that nuance there, you can't. It's hard. I'm trying to think of the like professional way to put it. It's difficult to try to measure the reality with what we see depicted on TV. The Sound of Freedom, Taken, those kind of things are easy to think about because it's a clean cut story. Like, the bad thing happens, the people are saved, the preferred victim. So, she's from an upper middle class family. She's all well and good. They make an effort to tell us that she's a virgin because her friend who is not a virgin is found in a dirty brothel. I believe she was like OD'd or something like that. But, so she's the one who's worthy. She was a virginal and pure. Her friend here, no, she was bad. So she gets this kind of death. And then, of course, it's hard to always argue against children. But it's easier to just latch onto those stories because then it's easier for us to ignore what traffickers look like. And, they look like our parents, our neighbors, our pastors, our teachers. They don't look like these scary people abroad over there, but they're very near close to us. And that's easier and more digestible than coming to the gritty reality of what actually trafficking is. It's vulnerability and violence and how it manifests. That's what it is. And it's more satisfying to watch and believe that it's that simple, that at the end of the day, the good guys are going to prevail, but sometimes they don't. They don't sometimes. Sometimes victims don't get someone to intervene. And I think too, I don't like how those movies, I'm not going to include Nora because I've never seen it. I haven't seen Sound of Freedom, but I know how it ends. It completely obscures the fact that it's really not uncommon for people who are being trafficked to take themselves out of the situation completely with no intervention because they've had no intervention. They were able to do that themselves. And it's easier for us to think because if you're able to remove yourself from it, or if you're able to, I don't like the term, someone said, like liberate themselves, which I don't like that terminology for that either. But if they're able to find a way to exit the trafficking situation on their own, then their victimhood gets accounted for. If you could get out now, why couldn't you do it before? You must have really wanted to do this. And it just opens up a whole can of really gross worms of how we construct the victim label and who has the right to be rescued and who should be rescued and who are the rescuers. viewers, and that's how we primarily guide how we know anti-trafficking. I've heard that story too of when victims came forward and then they were told, well, your story doesn't match this, so you're not actually a victim, which
Mhm.
the fact that we can get to that point, it definitely says there's something much more noxious going on societally.
So and I don't know if you have a number or if you can tell me like a proportion, because I think we tend to think of trafficking being something tied to criminal activity, organized criminal activity, where these victims are being moved from one location to another and then, being sold that way. But you mentioned that some of this is happening within the family or with somebody known. What is that proportion? What does that actually look like?
It depends on the sources. One of the things that's really difficult is that to combat something, we need really good data, and we don't
Hmm.
have good data at all.
Oh, okay.
Mainly because it's such a hidden crime, but also it comes down to who does our most crime counting. Most crime counting is done first at the state level and like really local levels with local officers. And if someone isn't recognizing or isn't able to see trafficking, then they're not logging in. They're logging into something else like, vandalism or not vandalism, vagrancy,
Hmm.
prostitution, drug use, or something else. And then we completely get that obscured. So I typically avoid looking at like hard statistics, but we do know is that most often people are trafficked by people that they know, by acquaintances, particularly loved ones, like parents, like friends, and like our spouses. And sometimes there's also been, this is what I do know is more rare. There's also been cases of children trafficking their parents when they're able to. And that's not as common, that we're able to see at least, but um, yeah. So if we talk about internationally, I did see there was one from the International Labor Organization. It wasn't for sex trafficking, it was for organ trafficking. And that, I believe they said it was like over 70% was tied to international criminal organization where they would
Hmm.
kidnap someone, they remove their organs. Sometime during that too, they were forced to do sex acts. So there was sexual violence within a different form of trafficking as well. So our numbers on this are not great, but we do know is that you are much more likely to be trafficked by someone that you know versus someone that you're passing in the airport. It does happen, but most advocates and legal resources, even cops and police officers who work in anti-trafficking will say like that's not the main one. Those ones are actually easier for prosecutors to prosecute. Those are actually the easier cases for them to deal with. It's much harder to try to build cases when the people that are trafficking you are the people that you love and care about, your parents, your guardians, or someone else like that. And especially too, because those are usually contained tightly within the home. For international trafficking, there's usually much more crossover with public spheres that you can get, which is easier to prosecute and to police, quite honestly.
Yeah, I would agree with that sentiment. And just to give sort of an anecdote to it, like when I was working with a couple of women at a certain period of time, they were all adults and they all lived in the same house, right? They lived in this sort of apartment building that was owned by this man who all of them had a romantic attraction and were in a romantic relationship with. And there was about, I don't know, I think 12 women living in this sort of structure. And all of them were sort of committing or sort of going out and like exchanging sexual acts for money and then coming back and giving the money to the man, and like he would regulate like what the quota they need to get, like, and if they didn't meet that quota they were beaten in several different sorts of ways and all of these things, and then he would go home at night to the suburbs to his wife and children. And so it's just, I think there's many examples of that, and especially what Dr. Young was saying too. It's like it is like more often people that you know, and so these kind of this kind of perception that it only happens across borders. You can stay in your hometown and be trafficked in your hometown. You can be trafficked in your own home. You don't have to physically move someplace. That's the kind of misnomer with the word,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But it really, and I think that's what you were saying, is it contributes to the confusion among law enforcement because the complexity is confusing. It sometimes looks like intimate partner violence, sometimes doesn't look like that. It sometimes just looks like a conflict between two people, but then it gets missed in records, and so missed in statistics. And so all of the kind of numbers are really fuzzy and typically based on more kind of third party, maybe reports than actual counting of people.
So you mentioned that you are advocating for some safety across the board, your rights for sex workers. Can you kind of help me out a little bit? Because I know some of the opposition is going to be these are people that asked to be in this position, that kind of victim blaming. So really, why should we spend resources on them? But there is a distinction. There are those who may have voluntarily gone into this and continue it voluntarily, those who are in it involuntarily, but we need safety across the board for both groups, right?
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing about what we know, like legally wise, like, and we only have a couple of examples outside of the United States of different kinds of legal structures for sex work, right? So in the United States, broadly, sex work is criminalized. The state of Maine, I don't know if people know, recently instituted the Nordic model, which criminalizes the buyers of sex,
Yeah.
but not the the sex workers, right?
Right.
Which also, again, at its face, people are like, this is so great, we're going to catch all the traffickers.
Yeah.
But then what it also potentially does, and we know this from other studies in the Nordic countries that have instituted this for a while, is that it then causes a higher amount of risk for the clients. And so the sex workers are then in a riskier position because they could potentially tell on their clients, and their clients know that. And so then they go for more, like, I mean, it's just a more vulnerable situation where the client could get mad, or if the client doesn't get what they want, but the sex worker then has the right to go to the police about it, it is then creates some potentially contentious conflict. And so I think what we know from sort of decriminalization efforts that are happening in New Zealand is the only place that has decriminalization right now, is that it improves relationships with the police, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it doesn't solve every problem with it, but like it improves the ability of people who have been harmed, who have had violence perpetrated against them, to go to the police and feel like they are going to get services or support or whatever they do need, right? And it also increases their willingness to prosecute an individual who's been violent against them. So these are basic safety tenets, right? In the United States right now, we can say, and I know law enforcement officers struggle with this, they're like, why don't they come to us when something happens? They should come to us, we can help them.
Right.
Maybe we won't arrest them for prostitution, but maybe they will.
Yeah.
You just never know. And if you're somebody in that scenario, are you going to take that chance? Are you going to trust this entity of law enforcement that has historically harmed you? And the overwhelming answer is no. And so this decriminalization, I feel like, honestly, would make law enforcement's job a lot easier too, because you hear from police officers that they are also tired and frustrated of trying to differentiate between, is this person guilty of prostitution or are they a victim of coercion? And I'm mostly talking about adults here. I primarily work with adults, but it takes away that idea and instead allows people to come to the police when they need help. And so I think most sex worker rights organizations and some anti-trafficking organizations are now arguing for decriminalization. So people might think of Nevada. Nevada is where, or actually just in 3 counties in Nevada. Right. It's not actually the whole state of Nevada, but some counties in Nevada have legalized prostitution. Now that's slightly different. If I could go on a small legal ramble for a second, the legalization, it does make legal the sale of sexual services, but it also regulates the sale of sexual services. So it's similar to, it's not the same thing, but the best analogy I have is the sale of marijuana, right? There's like limits to like how it can be grown, where it can be sold, all of these things, you need a license. So all of the sex workers in those counties in Nevada need a license in order to practice. And then they need to go to an established licensed facility to then be hired and potentially rent space. And then that transaction can occur legally, right? If somebody, say, doesn't have the money to rent that room, or that owner is not seen as like a safe place to go, and that sex worker, say, wants to go freelance and do it on their own time, they are then completely doing something as illegal as every other state.
Right.
So it's only legal in specific scenarios, whereas
Mhm.
decriminalization would make the act of selling sex legal. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't be subject to like OSHA requirements or like requirements that we already have for like non-discrimination, workers' rights, all of these things. Just like any other kind of industry, it would be subject to those standards, but it wouldn't be subject to like being illegal
Mhm.
in any sense of the word. So we could find ways to make it safe, find ways for this decriminalization to promote anti-sex trafficking, to help reduce violence and reduce coercion and up resources. But right now, that's a big jump from
Yeah.
where we're at.
Yeah. Dr. Young, did you have a follow-up?
I do. I think one of the things that gets muddled, particularly because again, the United States, we're very, I think globally, I'm not going to just confine it to the United States. I think honestly, globally, like we've lost a lot of ability to talk with nuance. I blame social media personally, quite honestly, because I think it really has impacted some folks' like ability to think in more complex or non-binary ways. Sometimes we're used to like easily digestible sound bites or like real quick readings. One of the things I always get pressed on when people talk about, like decriminalization, then you're advocating for sex work, and that's not what that's saying. They're not saying like now everybody go out and go do sex work. No one is saying that. We're saying remove the criminalization aspect that creates for vulnerabilities that can really hinder anti-trafficking efforts and endangers people more often than not. Um, I think probably I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. One of the things that we do know with policing and anti-trafficking and sex work is that split kind of decision that often they have to make, usually right in the heat of the moment, right when they're being called to something, and that without proper adequate time to consider all factors, we can get a great deal of misidentification. One of the biggest, I think, kind of the biggest pushbacks I see with decriminalization is that again the one group that we think is easier to kind of push to advocate for because usually they don't have. I don't think people realize how very little rights children have in the United States in general, like not even those like not within a juvenile institution. Like they're the ones in society that have the least amount of rights because they're not considered full autonomous beings until they reach 18. There's always someone that has the final say in what they can do. But the people that always get thrown out for against decriminalization arguments is children. Well, now children are going to get into it, and then people are going to abuse them. That's happening anyway under the prohibition that we have. And with decriminalization, it's illegal in all 50 states and at the federal level to charge a minor with prostitution charges. That still happens, unfortunately. We know that it happens primarily among Native American and Black girls, and then LGBTQ youth as well. Decriminalization removes that risk of criminalization because when we know that when children are criminalized, the earlier they're criminalized, the longer their length is with being recriminalized and reintroduced to the criminal justice system again and again, well into adulthood, and how generational that can be actually. So that was my addition there. Like that we always throw out like, the children without actually considering what's going on to put the children in that situation in the first place. That's again like we need to look more at preventative methods and like what to do about when it's already happened. Like worry about how to not get people there to that point instead of like instead of doing like this back and forth that we keep doing as well. That's something that I keep saying, and that's not a very popular. I don't know if you've gotten this response to Dr. Stenersen, but it's not always popular for some reason. Say we work on like preventative, like addressing vulnerability and ending vulnerability, but it's easier to say things like, we need to do more policy interventions or something. For some reason, that's more digestible. And I think again, that comes down to like it's easier for us to think about than like focus on like the kind of harms and trauma that's going on because that's more of an uncomfortable conversation. But yeah, no, that's I agree with those arguments for the decriminalization model.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I've seen a lot of anti-trafficking organizations who are doing really good work and know that those sorts of systemic changes would make a huge difference for the people that they serve, just having resources available. But when they go to try to find funders or donate or donors or fundraising for things, they find themselves pressured, like externally or internally, they feel pressure to go back to like the vision of handcuffs, the vision of kidnapping, you know, the vision that like, this is so terrible and this is what we're going to do for the survivors afterwards. You know, it has to be like human trafficking centered services rather than trying to go out and be like, but actually we could use money so all of our clients could go to school, you know, or we could use money for all of these things that we could do for the community rather than maybe just the people who've been identified as trafficking victims or survivors. And so I completely agree. I think the prevention aspect is really hard. I think you see that also in our healthcare system. The funding for prevention is really difficult. But I hear more and more people talking about it, and even including the people that used to have the kind of rescue language, you know, we got to rescue everybody. I should be in charge of how they're doing afterwards, those sorts of things. You see more and more people being like, but actually, maybe if they had access to this thing before, I wouldn't have been needed, you know, and that's kind of the goal, right? Is to have like this to be eliminated ultimately. So creating the conditions where that can happen definitely starts with that prevention side.
So you both mentioned decriminalization, and this probably would have been a point where I would have asked, you know, what can change in the criminal justice system. But how do you get this message out? How do you change the popular mindset that, you know, again, going back to some people choose to do this, some people have no choice. Maybe we should try to rescue. And once again, we're getting back to that. Dr. Stenersen, you mentioned that most of these organizations are faith-based, so there's probably an agenda coming in. How do we sell this to the general public and break down some of those restrictions?
Yeah. So I'll caveat that I don't have a statistic that most of them are faith-based.
Oh,
I
okay.
work a lot. I work a lot in Southeast Asia, and the faith influence there is very high.
Okay.
So internationally speaking, the faith community is huge in the anti-trafficking movement. Their presence is really undeniable, but I can't say I know exactly the percentage, so I'll clarify that.
Okay.
But I do think, yeah, how do we get people engaged? One of the things that I find really interesting that's happening in the United States, and I don't even know if like researchers or service providers or anybody can really take credit for this, but the openness and the kind of availability of sex work avenues online has totally changed this conversation. OnlyFans has come in like a bull in a china shop and just kind of
Yeah.
like not in a negative way. I don't mean that, but like
Yeah.
it's just, I mean, it's exploded and it's changed how people see sex work, what sex work is, who does sex work, all of these different things and how accessible it is. Similar with sugaring. Sugaring is a different like there's apps for it. I mean, maybe they've been around longer than I know of, but like I'm now learning of all of these apps that are particularly popular among college students to get in sugaring arrangements and those sorts of things. And so the accessibility of being involved in one way or another in the sex industry is so much different. And you're seeing the changes in attitudes, especially among younger generations, to like saying you're a sex worker or saying that you work in camming or saying that you do these things. And I will say, I do think those scenarios they exist within the societal disparities that we have as a society at large, right? So we see sugaring being more lucrative and available to students from higher income backgrounds. And so we need to also balance it with like, who is getting these opportunities to engage in these less stigmatized areas of sex work. But in general, you see a societal shift happening now, and it is starting to be reflected in, now there's much more to do. There's so much more to do. I don't want to minimize that, but like Illinois just came out the other day with a proposed safety bill for sex workers, like sex worker safety bill. And really people are potentially moving. I mean, the decriminalization kind of advocacy still is happening, but a lot of people are finding other ways to really just promote This is a bill focused on safety, focused on anti-violence, right? These are the ways in which we can ensure that sex workers have rights. This is a very different scenario, but I think it was Belgium who recently put forth, like they passed a bill giving sex workers maternity leave and employment benefits similar to every other profession. And you can just imagine what those benefits would do to somebody who maybe doesn't want to be in sex work as their first option. You know, they could potentially explore other options, whereas maybe they didn't have those options before. So that's my spiel. I think it's changing, it's coming, but of course, you just kind of still try to add the complexity to the societal viewpoint. Still try to add that it doesn't mean that sex trafficking isn't happening. It doesn't mean that it's still not a huge problem. And this kind of new wave of sex work likely doesn't represent all scenarios or people.
Dr. Young?
I've been asked this before, and I never have a good answer to it because I don't. I'll add a caveat. Like the new avenues for doing sex work is truly amazing. Like I always like seeing things get like diversified in manifestations. My problem, and this is something too, particularly like when I go back to like within like my advocacy work in like the Black community and with survivors there too, is how often that can be weaponized against them as well.
Mhm.
Of how often like it goes back to like the whole idea of like you're like pretty woman, even though again like no one they're not thinking that they're becoming Julia Roberts or anything else like
Yeah.
that. But how often that can be weaponized against them to show, to kind of contrast them and to assign consent when there is no consent. That's the part I always worry about, particularly with how perilous like the social media landscape is for more disenfranchised folks. Like the general harassment that particularly Black girls get online is huge, and particularly the sexualization that happens to them as well. Sex and body construction is different depending on our gender, race, and everything else going on there.
Mhm.
And I feel I do like, I'll go to OnlyFans. OnlyFans is pretty popular and it's a very like open platform. I don't know about their safety precautions. I've never looked too deep into it, but from what little research I've read on it, they said they have some good preventive tools and policing tools to make sure that anything that involves minors or anything that looks like it not be could be consent is removed pretty swiftly, which I think is pretty good. So it's not something, like Pornhub that is notoriously bad for this. Like it's
Mhm.
very bad for that. But on the flip side of that, like there's a certain kind of person that gets popularized on there and who's kind of gets the praise for like doing this groundbreaking breaking work. And I'm agreeing, again, I'm in agreement with everything that Dr. Stenton said, but there's also like the other caveat. And for me, with particularly being with like more of a race scholar, I'm always looking at like, okay, but how is that affecting these other people? I One thing I do like about social media, and I'm talking about me as like a millennial who no longer uses it, younger people like Gen Z are very good at using it to have more nuanced conversation. I think that people in my age group do with it, quite honestly. They're using it to be more aware and to make connections with people that they don't normally see because we usually are insulated in our silos with people who look and have similar experiences with us. So I do appreciate that. And I do see a lot of really good nuances and discussions that my students show me. My students are showing me this. I'm not doing it. Like I've got TikTok and Instagram and all that stuff they have. But they're showing really good like accounts of people sharing their experiences and what they've learned about them and different things like that. So that does make me hopeful. For me, I'm looking at like that discourse too of what's going on societally and how we're combating like those root causes. So I'm ambivalent, I suppose, is the way I can approach this. But I kind of view again because typically with especially like Black folk, particularly Black vulnerable girls and women, and particularly trans women, they usually get the shorter end of the stick when something else happens. So that's kind of where I stick with that. And I don't mean to sound like a Debbie Downer with that, but that's where that like ambivalence come from. It's like, okay, let's do a good balancing act there. And I haven't quite gotten the words for how we can describe or how to implement the balancing. I'm working on that though. I'm working on it.
Yeah, I
So
think
it
that's a
sounds
great.
like, yes, it sounds like maybe stripping away the stigma gives us a better avenue of helping those who are doing this involuntarily.
Yeah, stigma helps nobody but perpetrators and people who want to do violence. They're the only ones that benefit from stigma.
Okay. Doctors Young and Stenersen, we are right up at the final hour, or right at the hour. Do you have anything that you'd like to leave our audience with?
Uh, despite my ambivalence and kind of pessimism, honestly, I have seen people who have survived the worst of things and they're the most optimistic and happy people because they realize that there is inherent good in folks, despite people who actively do harm to others. But I do think that we as a society are capable of a great deal of change and transformation for the better. I don't know if that'll happen while I'm still alive, but I am confident that with newer generations, that it is possible. So that's what I want to leave, that good things are possible and that there is radical change will come.
I would agree. I think I would just echo that. I see a lot of really promising things on the horizon. And I think what you're calling, Dr. Young, ambivalence, I totally agree, is the absolute necessity to continue this conversation to ensure that everybody is included and has a seat at the table, regardless of their degree or all of their background or their identification, all of it. And so I see more of this, more spaces for that to be able to happen. There needs to be much, much more. But even access to the decision makers, I think, is potentially changing. I don't know. There is some optimism and hope.
Great. Dr. Young, Dr. Stenersen, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you.
you.
Fun.
Okay.
Conversation on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University, San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Pfau Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Then Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crafton provides administrative support, and Alan Yorba provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming, and find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, and Dorothy Roberts, and many more.